Well, thank you for joining us. This is part two of our conversation in our class section dealing with the prophetic elements of preaching. And for me, it's important for us to think about how do we enter into engaging the prophetic aspects of preaching. And so, a way that's helpful for me, and a way that might be helpful to try on for the different preachers who are exposed to this video, is that I think about radical complicity, and I preach from a place of radical complicity because what that allows me to do is it provides me a footing to address the issues of the day as a person amongst the community. So if we extend Tom Long's claim about the witness, and you are bearing witness to your experience with God in the world, and then relaying that to the people for the edification of their faith, and then them empowering you to have the authority to share with them your God experience. If we tease that out a couple of steps, then we find ourselves being as radically complicit as the people that we talk to. And then even more so because we have the audacity to stand up and tell the people about the things that we all do. But what's extremely humbling and helpful in that regard is that it gives us a place to begin to critically assess the world, because we don't have to be defensive about an identity that decontextualizes our actions in the world. So in my pocket is an iPhone. And if you understand how an iPhone is made and from the sundry countries that these minerals come from, and under the circumstances in which they arrive, and how much energy it takes to be able to, once you begin to unpack the full ramifications of just one of our consumables, we realize that we're complicit. And then when you begin to layer the fact that we live in a world in which our shirt comes from China, our shoes come from Bangladesh, our refrigerator came from Indonesia, we begin to see that there's sin is an inescapable network. So as much as we strive for personal piety, that personal piety is called into account when we assess the context that we're in. So when we look at Isaiah chapter 6, we find that the root of Isaiah's ability to be an effective prophet comes from his ability to understand that he is a person of unclean lips. He is just like, he is of the social imagination of the people that he's speaking to. He understands the political and social situation. The king dies. A lot is tied up with the king, prosperity, and their understanding of God, and the ways in which they imagine their future. All of those things are wrapped up in their political hope. But in order for Isaiah to be an effective prophet, he has to diagnose that socio-political reality so that he can then offer a theological hope that supersedes, that undergirds, and that encompasses the superficial hope that people had in a king or a person. So what I want to do and talk to my colleagues about is, if we take the position of radical complicity or complicities, how does that then free us to speak about some of the harder things in our context? So I can speak for myself as one who travels about. It's a very tricky thing for me, because I don't know what is considered radical, taboo, prophetic for the congregation that I'm going to. So that one church is taboos, and other churches, understood assumption. And so it's important for me to gain a sense of, where is God pushing this community, and why did God invite me to share? Because clearly God wants me to aid in this work of expanding. But what is my responsible yet prophetic way of meeting God in that work? So it goes back to some of the things we talked about last time and the time before, about reading your context, knowing the history of the place, knowing the demographics, listening to the anecdotal town evidence, just being astute, but also realizing God is pushing all of us to be better Christians and calling all of us to a higher level. So where is God calling this congregation, and how can I support that? So where can I lean into the scriptures that day? Where can I really lean in? Because the lectionary becomes an invitation. So where can I engage the lectionary in that work of further clearing the ground for God to do something new? So I'm paying attention to, what are the readings? What is the rector saying? What are the people saying? Where is God leading me? And lastly, where where is God leading me in my ministry, and how can I impart that to where they're going? So prophetic for me isn't just a static set of issues, but it's where is God, but where is God in the midst of all that work? So Professor Turner, how do you, if you, as being one of the congregation, speaking to them, but yet as to then operate in this intermediate way, how do you engage in dealing with some of the difficult issues that harangue some of our congregations?
You know, this is one of the things where I am very grateful that we are in a sacramental church and that we often preach in liturgical and sacramental contexts, because um, the word and the verbal act of preaching is couched in this larger experience that has to do with a lot of tangible and tactile things. Because I often think about the prophets and how so much of what the biblical prophets did and said was actually what they did more than what they said. That they did all of these weird and bizarre things because they were weird and bizarre people. So, you know, Jeremiah like lay down on one side or wore a dirty loincloth, or you know, all of those different things. That is not going to be what I do, but it is a reminder that engaging in these things, these topics, is set into the larger context of physically what I'm doing among people. One of the things that clergy often hear is on pastoral visits is people don't remember what you said, they remember that you came. And I feel like the prophetic preaching extension of that is people don't always remember, you know, your stance on a particular issue, but they remember that you were willing to engage it. And so, you know, it's that sense of being the object, being the person who is willing to stand in that space and let people's interpretive faculties of God's sign work on you where you are.
Dr. Hook, how do you think about and engage us in thinking about the ways in which we're deeply complicit, but also in that, where's the hope if we're also deeply complicit in an environment where you're helping to form priests and you're helping to shape us for the church? How do you help us to think about these issues? How do you preach them?
It's difficult. It's difficult. I think in this seminary environment, um, we're so it's tricky. I mean, I think we are both deeply aware of our complicity and also perhaps not clear on how to address it as a school and as individuals in the school. Um, and so I feel I have to be very careful not to say things over and over again that people already know. So they already know, you know, like the history of racism here at VTS, the history of enslaved people working here and building our buildings. And, you know, people know that and feel it. And sometimes when we say it too many times, people just kind of shut down. So how does one preach in such a way as to draw people forward rather than just miring them in this kind of hopelessness that can come about? I think it is, as Anne said, partly pointing to actions that go beyond the words of preaching, and partly one's presence in the community as a person who cares about the community and wants the community to thrive. I think those are some of the things. But every now and then I've heard very political sermons here on campus that have just really, really motivated people. And it's been wonderful. I think it's sermons that are really rooted in Christian theology, because this is the currency that means something very profound to this community. Very rooted in Christian theology, very rooted in solid exegesis. That those kinds of sermons really have more credibility in this context than they might in a parish, because we're listening for that and we're looking for that. So at times when I've heard very powerful political sermons here on campus, it's been rooted in the deep tradition, as I said, before, that prophets are speaking out of a tradition. And then it tends to be people who have gained the trust of the institution, of not the institution, but the people. When they speak, it sounds different, and people are able to take it on in a way that otherwise is just sort of too exhausting, or we know it too well, but we can't figure out a way to move beyond it.
One of the things that I hear that kind of ties up not only our conversation today, but thought in previous week, is that prophetic preaching, or engaging in the prophetic elements of preaching, requires a plan. And you can't just wing it, because unfortunately what happens when people wing sermons like this or stances like this is that oftentimes they're not supported by a foundation of strong scriptural support, week to week building and layering of foundations, so that when people hear a swell of sermons about a particular thing, sometimes for the listener it can seem disingenuous, because why is this a thing now when you're preaching for X amount of years, never touched on this? And if you've had a personal conversion, you owe that conversation to those who listen to you, so that they can then begin to assess how to listen. But what I'm noticing is that as people are becoming aware of the world that has already existed, they want to overrun toward that way, when in actuality they haven't set the ground up and the conversations up to move people to begin to have conversations about seeing the world differently. So just like we talk about claim, focus, function, sermon journal, and being very thoughtful and tactical in terms of how is God moving you to arrange your sermon, think about that order of arrangement over a broader period of time for your preaching, because to address issues in a topical and superficial way in many ways causes people to see them as ancillary to the gospel. So how we engage in the prophetic task shows people how central is that prophetic task to the heart of God. Mm-hmm. If it's ancillary for us, and if we treat it as so, then people are not going to see this as primary to God's concern for humanity and God's intention for creation. So one of the aspects that we're inviting you to do is to really think about your preaching, not just in terms of doing the exegesis and trying to find the story, but to think about, how is God forming the people that you've been entrusted with? And where is God taking them? And how is God taking you and leading you so that you can then be with and lead them? So prophetic preaching is less about teaching you how to preach sermons about issues and more of asking you to challenge this world's imagination with God's imagination. But in order to do that, we have to then better ourselves and grow ourselves as Christians, as scholars, as preachers, as pastors, as persons, so that the work that God seeks to do in us can translate through our sermons, and not our sermons be our only stand to the prophetic. So are there any closing comments that my colleagues have in terms of thinking practically about prophetic preaching? I would just say, be aware of your political, social blind spots. And by being aware of that, it'll allow you to be an honest prophet, not an unbiased prophet, but an honest prophet. And people can respect honesty. Are there any other perspectives you would like to provide? Either one of you?
I'll just say, be ready to be convicted by your own words. And that gets back to the really hard thing about preaching is not about being a better preacher. It's about being a better person. And you can't preach this stuff and not get changed.
And I would just add that this topic links up with the topic on the arts and creativity, because in the Brueggemann book, he talks about preachers speaking in poetry in poetic ways, because those are ways that break through the numbness and allow us to name what's really happening. But also, as we set forth a vision, it's in the form of poetry often. If you look at Isaiah, the second Isaiah, all those pictures of restoration and of being fed and of coming to the banquet and all are couched in poetry. There's no other way to talk about them, because they engage the whole person in this vision of what doesn't exist yet, but God is bringing into being. So when we asked you in this last assignment to write an oracle, that's in the form of poetry, basically, as the prophets did. And that gives you permission, the oracle gives you permission to speak truth you might not have found an ability to speak before. And even talking to the students in my section, that was the effect of the assignment. It sort of it unlocked something, some part of their voice that they were able to then say things that they had wanted to say but couldn't find ways to say. And then the art piece is also like a way of engaging poetically with texts, but that's linked to the prophetic because it's unlocking that part of your voice, and that part of your imagination is part of how we move into prophetic preaching.
Well, we thank you all for your time and your attention. We hope that you feel a little more equipped to engage in the issues of the world. We ask that not only are you going to better yourself in terms of paying attention to what's happening in the world, but we're asking that you allow God to deal with you about the places where you come up short, because wherever you come up short, that's preaching, as a place of preaching when engaging someone else. So the prophetic task starts with you. Well, thank you for your time, and we look forward to seeing you next week.